Well, welcome. Welcome to both the local and remote audiences. Once again, we're live streaming to the Howard Baker Center at UT Knoxville. Hopefully, we've got the live stream to Battelle working, and we're also webcasting. What that means is when we get to the question and answer period at the end, anyone who's viewing remotely can submit questions via Facebook and Twitter, using hashtag Wigner Lecture to identify their questions, and then hopefully that'll pop up on the screen there and we'll be able to see them. There's enough people here that I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions one way or the other. I'd like to recognize a couple of special guests. From UT Knoxville, we're joined by Jimmy Cheek, the Chancellor, and I think Taylor Amy is here. Taylor's sitting in the back. He's the Vice Chancellor for Research and Engagement. From Senator Corker's office, Jane Jolly, the Field Director, is here, I think. Hi, Jane. Johnny Moore, the Manager of the ORNL Site Office, is with us, sitting down here in the front. And there's probably a few other people that I missed, so apologies. So this is the, let me count, I guess the fourth lecture in this Eugene P. Wigner Distinguished Lecture Series in Science, Technology, and Policy. And for those of you who don't know, I'll remind you that we launched this series in November on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of first criticality at the graphite reactor, which I have decided is the birthday of the lab. You can define the birthday in different ways. You could say, when did the land get expropriated from all the families who were living in this part of the world who'd previously been expropriated when the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and Norris Dam were built, and then the government came again and knocked on their door and said, we're from the government, we're here to help, you have 2 weeks to leave. You could say that it got started when the ground was broken on the graphite reactor, but I really think it's all about first criticality. So that was our first lecture in this series, was on that 70th anniversary. This series is organized by our corporate fellows, who are some of our more celebrated researchers, and the goal is to invigorate scientific discovery, spur technological innovation, and initiate productive scientific policy debate. And of course, the lectures honor Eugene Wigner, who might be termed the patron saint of Oak Ridge National Lab. And for a couple of reasons. I think one of them is just if you follow the arc of his career and his interests, you can see their imprint today. He trained as a chemical engineer, but he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1963 for atomic theory and made very important contributions to the role of fundamental symmetries in atomic theory and, of course, subsequently in what we now call nuclear and particle physics. He was also one of the founders of the field of nuclear engineering and was really a role model for the coupling of basic and applied work. He was the research director of ORNL, or as it was then known, Clinton Labs, in the very critical post-war years, 1946 and 1947. And his task at that time was to develop what we would now call the strategic plan for the lab. In fact, it was actively debated whether or not there should be an ongoing research institution. It was fairly clear that we were going to head into what became the Cold War. There was going to be some kind of geopolitical standoff with the Soviet Union. And clearly this new technology of nuclear was going to be important. So there wasn't really much doubt that Y-12 and K-25 would continue, but X-10, as it was then known, had been started up as the R&D facility in support of that production complex, and most of the scientists and engineers who'd relocated from University of Chicago and Berkeley and Columbia and so forth were really eager to get back to academia, get back to their students and their research. So there was a question of, what should we do with the research facility? And the National Lab concept was one that Wigner played a key role in developing. At the time, they were calling them regional nucleonics laboratories. And he laid out the plan for research that involved the peaceful development of nuclear, so development of nuclear power, isotope production for medical and commercial purposes, And the underlying science and technology of the nuclear physics and the materials and the chemistry that was needed to support this new technology. And that blueprint was then the blueprint that Alvin Weinberg inherited initially as research director and then as laboratory director. And he was a real protege of Wigner's. So when Wigner left in 1947, he kind of handed the reins to Alvin. They remained close friends. In fact, we found a lot of the correspondence at the Children's Museum between them over the years. And of course, Weinberg remained at Ornell until 1973, where actually he went on to play a role that was then the equivalent of what today's speaker is doing. There was not an OSTP at the time in the Nixon administration, but Alvin became the advisor to the president around what was then called Project Independence, which was the national response to the Arab oil embargo. And to some extent, you could say we're still working on Project Independence, although we've redefined the boundary conditions a little bit since then. The role that Alvin played is one that I think is also important and relevant to the Wigner theme that overlies these lectures. He served as a member of the panel that's now called PCAST earlier in 1962. He recruited Wigner to actually chair a panel on scientific information. And it was really the early recognition of what we now call the big data challenge, what Weinberg called the flood of scientific information. And he proposed a solution, which was specialized information centers led by scientists and engineers. The concern at the time was the explosion in scientific literature that happened following the Second World War, inspired in this country by some of the work of Bush, Vannevar Bush, and the Science, the Endless Frontier. Federal investments as a vehicle for national security and economic development had really manifested themselves in the Second World War, and that led to the creation of things like the National Science Foundation. But it also led to an explosion in the volume of research, literature, and understanding. And the question was, how are we as a society possibly going to digest and extract value from that? And so that was the challenge in this panel. And in his 1994 memoir, Weinberg concluded that extraordinary improvements in computers had opened new possibilities in information handling that didn't exist at the time that Wigner was involved in this report in 1962. But he also stated that scientific information will remain a perennial topic for future PSAC panels. And maybe in the Q&A we can talk a little bit about some of what PCAST has been saying about this, because our lecturer today is John Holdren, who is, amongst other things, the co-chair of PCAST, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. He is also co-appointed as the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and also assistant to the President for Science and Technology. Those kind of three activities are all rolled into one. He's been at Harvard University, where he's the Teresa and John Heinz Professor of Environmental Policy and Director of the Program on Science, Technology, and Public Policy at the Kennedy School of Government, a professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, and Director of the Woods Hole Research Center. From 1973 to 1996, he was a faculty member at the University of California, Berkeley, and served as a member of PCAST during both terms of the Clinton administration. And he chaired studies on a range of topics. Many there are of direct interest to Oak Ridge National Lab, including preventing the theft of nuclear materials, disposing of surplus weapons plutonium, which is a hot topic today with the questions around the MOX plant in Savannah River. The prospects for fusion energy, well, that's another hot topic these days with the ITER project, and overall the U.S. energy research and development strategy, as well as international cooperation in energy technology innovation. From 1970 to 73, he worked as a physicist at Lawrence Livermore National Lab in the Theory Group in the Magnetic Fusion Energy Division. His training, he has a bachelor's, master's of science from MIT, and a PhD from Stanford in aeronautical, astronautical, and electrical engineering. He's the co-author of over 300 publications and has been recognized with many awards, including the MacArthur Fellowship in 1981, the John Heinz Prize in Public Policy, the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement, and the Volvo Environment Prize. In December of 1995, he presented the acceptance lecture for the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs for work to rid the world of weapons of mass destruction. He was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 1991 and the National Academy of Engineering in 2000. His lecture topic today is on the slide, Science and Technology Policy in the Obama Administration. Please join me in welcoming John Holdren.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here at the Oak Ridge National Lab. I'm embarrassed to say that I have never been here before, but I do have a long-standing connection with this place. One of my most important mentors was the late Harrison Brown, who, during the Manhattan Project, was the director of the chemistry division here in his mid-20s. Because of my work with Harrison Brown, I was privileged to meet Alvin Weinberg and had many constructive and productive interactions with Dr. Weinberg over the years. So I feel a strong connection to this place, even though, to my embarrassment, this is my first visit. I'm going to cover a lot of ground today, and I'm going to run through an excess of PowerPoint slides rather rapidly in many cases. So I want to assure you that if you miss any detail and would like to revisit it, this presentation will be posted on the OSTP website, www.ostp.gov. I start with President Obama's commitment in his first inauguration speech to restore science to its rightful place, and I'm going to say a little bit about what he meant by that and what he did about it. And I start with the place of science on the agenda. We are fortunate, I think, to have a president who understands how and why science, technology, and innovation matter to most of the major challenges that we face as a society and as a world. And those are listed here. I won't read them to you because you can read faster than I can talk, and you can also see the slide on the website later. The place of science in the White House is centered in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. It sits around the president together with a great many other White House offices with which we work very closely. The ones with which we work most closely are the ones inside that semicircle, the Office of Management and Budget, Council on Environmental Quality, and so on. We have really two major responsibilities in OSTP, and this formulation is due to another of my mentors, the late Harvey Brooks, who noted that science and technology policy divide themselves into these two domains, policy for science and technology for policy. And the first domain comes, first of all, the oversight of the science and technology budgets of the federal government, working closely with OMB and other White House offices and with the departments and agencies, figuring out what the president will recommend or what we recommend to him to recommend in his budget submissions to the Congress about R&D investments. But we also, in this domain, under this heading of policy for science and technology, have responsibility for STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math education, workforce issues, broadband, open government, scientific integrity, and we oversee both the National Science Foundation and NASA, which do not sit in their own cabinet departments. On the other side, of course, science and technology for policy is the primary responsibility we have to ensure that the president knows what he needs to know about the scientific and technological dimensions of the policy choices that he faces. The structure of OSTP, we have a little over 100 people, most of them technical. About 55 of them are detailees from science and technology-based departments and agencies. We also have folks who are on leave from universities. We have fellows from some of the science and technology societies, and we have typically 6 to 10 interns. We have really 5 major divisions. One is the Office of the Chief Technology Officer, who is now Todd Park, and the other 4 are listed at the bottom: Science, technology and innovation, environment and energy, and national security and international affairs. Our 100 folks are roughly evenly distributed across the 5 divisions. How did we get all the way to there? That slide is, well, a little out of place, but let me mention that we do have a lot of engagement in national security issues. This is probably the least well-known domain of OSTP activity because a lot of it is classified, but we very strongly support the National Security Council staff as well as the Department of Defense and the intelligence community in the scientific and technological dimensions of what they do. We also have the responsibility for managing a number of entities which reach across the government and out into the wider world in a number of ways. The National Science and Technology Council is focused on science and technology activities that cross agency boundaries. It is nominally chaired by the President, but he delegates that responsibility to me. It is administered in my office, OSTP, and it has standing committees that very much resemble the division structure of OSTP. We jointly run the National Oceans Council with the Council on Environmental Quality, implementing the national policy on oceans, coasts, and the Great Lakes. We co-chair the Interagency Council on Climate Change Preparedness and Resilience with CEQ and the National Security Council staff. And I co-chair with the science and technology ministers of 6 countries the bilateral joint commissions on science and technology cooperation. The countries are listed there. I also co-chair with the Russian science and technology minister the Science and Technology Working Group of the U.S.-Russia Presidential Commission, and its focuses are listed there. Finally, I co-chair with the Science and Technology Minister of China something called the U.S.-China Dialogue on Innovation Policy, which is focused on some of the challenging issues between the United States and China around intellectual property, joint ventures, and so on. Also, as already mentioned, I co-chair with Eric Lander of the MIT Harvard Broad Institute for Genomics, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. There has been a PCAST or its equivalent under every U.S. president since Eisenhower, although, as already mentioned, there was a period in the Nixon administration when it did not exist because President Nixon became very unhappy with some of the recommendations of the then equivalent President's Science Advisory Committee. Of our 20 members, 19 keep their day jobs and advise the White House part-time. I'm the only member whose day job is in the government. And the idea behind PCAST is to provide an additional source of advice on science and technology for the President and to help link OSTP and the rest of the White House to the wider science and technology community, and we support this operation in OSTP. These are the members of the second-term Obama PCAST. The 4 at the top are the co-chairs and the 2 vice chairs. As you can see, it is a diverse group in terms of discipline, gender, ethnicity, and geography, but every member is a very energetic contributor to advising the President and the White House, and one can see that in the number of studies completed during the Obama administration to date. They're listed here, and again, you see an enormous diversity of topics. These are topics on which the President has asked for PCAST help to lay out the issues, clarify the options for him. And again, one sees reflected here the extraordinarily broad interests of this President in the different ways that science and technology and innovation matter to our society. He has, more than just commissioning all these studies, he has embraced a large proportion of the recommendations that those PCAST studies have contained. And listed on this slide are some of the PCAST recommendations that actually have been embraced by the President, embodied in his budgets across a wide variety of domains, starting with STEM education, including how we are able to respond to influenza pandemics, how we plan for the technological dimensions of our energy future, electronic health records in healthcare, the launching of the network of advanced manufacturing centers. That was a PCAST recommendation. Most recently, the new budget has funding for 3 new multidisciplinary research institutes for agriculture after the PCAST report on that subject said we are not doing enough to prepare for the challenges to agriculture in the 21st century. Other things the President has done to, quote, restore science to its rightful place. Appointments. I don't think any president has appointed as many Nobel laureates or members of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to the government. He has appointed the first ever Chief Technology Officer and Chief Information Officer at the very beginning of his term. I don't think any president has talked as much about science, technology, and innovation and about STEM education and why they matter. I don't think any president has ever organized and hosted as many White House events around science and technology issues, particularly exciting ones, the 3 White House science fairs where we've had dozens and dozens of winners of national competitions in the middle school and high school level, presidents down on the floor crawling around with the kids in their robots, firing the marshmallow cannon, interrogating amazing young kids about the discoveries they've made in cancer research. It's mind-boggling. In my day, it was baking soda volcanoes, and now they're finding ways to advance cancer therapy. This is from the President's speech to the National Academy of Sciences annual meeting just a few months after his first inauguration. He was the first president since JFK to do that. And to the astonishment of many in that speech, the President spent about 60% of the speech talking about the importance of basic research, of fundamental research. Most folks, I think, expected the President a few months into his administration to be talking about science and technology for the economy, for public health, for national and homeland security, for energy and climate. He did mention those things, but he decided to devote most of his remarks to how and why fundamental research, basic research, is the seed corn from which all applied advances have to grow, and it is a fundamental responsibility of the government to support that domain of research because the private sector will never do enough of it. American Innovation Strategy, launched early in his administration and then updated, has a number of components that are reflected in other initiatives I'll talk about, starting with the building blocks of innovation, education with 21st century skills, fundamental research, the relevant infrastructure, the IT ecosystem, promoting market-based innovation, the second ingredient, including work that I was talking about with some of your local high-tech entrepreneurs just yesterday, how we accelerate the transition of discovery from national laboratories and research universities into the marketplace, effective intellectual property rights policies, trying to make permanent as well as simpler and larger the research and experimentation tax credit so that the more than 2/3 of research and development that go on in the private sector will also be further encouraged. Catalyzing breakthroughs for national priorities. Of course, you know what those are. And some cross-cutting aspects. Increased support for scientists and engineers early in their careers. More engagement of women and girls in STEM fields. And of course, I've already mentioned commercializing university research. And again, focusing on multidisciplinary and high-risk, high-return research, which tends to be underfunded in parts of the private sector. Public-private partnerships, as I've already noted, private sector performs most U.S., funds most U.S. R&D and performs most of it. I mentioned the tax credit. The Recovery Act boosted in a number of ways businesses in the high-tech domain, including particularly clean energy businesses. Small Business Innovation Research Initiative has been very important. The Department of Energy's Energy Innovation Hubs linking national labs, universities, and industry have been important. Here's the President on one of his private sector visits in the high-tech space. We launched in January 2011 an initiative called Startup America, aimed at bolstering entrepreneurship by increasing the success rate in high-growth, high-tech startups with a number of specific ingredients, including small business financing, improving the regulatory environment, and spawning the nonprofit Startup America Partnership. Was followed in spring of 2012 by the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act with crowdfunding, an IPO on-ramp, and more. Further in this domain, the Wireless Innovation and Infrastructure Initiative, aiming to connect 98% of the U.S. population with 4G wireless. Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, again, another initiative linking research universities, high-tech companies, federal labs to create high-quality manufacturing jobs, a goal reinforced by the National Robotics Initiative and the Materials Genome Initiative, and NSF's Innovation Corps, which is getting scientists out of the lab to start new companies with the help of training from successful entrepreneurs for scientists and engineers working on NSF projects. Another very interesting initiative has been the use of prizes to encourage innovation. All federal agencies have the authority under the America Competes Reauthorization Act to offer prizes for specified advances. Also something that we encourage in the Strategy for American Innovation. And the idea of prizes is, number one, you can emphasize a particular ambitious goal without trying to pick the winners in advance, without picking the approach in advance. You lay out the goal and let the innovation community figure out how best to achieve it. You pay only for results. You cast the net more widely in terms of the sources of talent that can be brought to bear on these challenges. And often these prizes and challenges end up stimulating private sector investment that is often many times greater than the purse for the prize. A good example of this was the 2010 Automotive X-Prize, which offered $10 million in prizes and called forth over $100 million in investment to win the $10 million in prizes, aiming for vehicles that would achieve more than 100 miles per gallon equivalent. And these were cars that were actually built and operated, and many of them got 200 miles a gallon equivalent. We now have 300-plus prize competitions at more than 50 agencies that are in effect, and those can all be accessed at the website Challenge.gov, a one-stop shop for a prize challenge that innovators might want to take a shot at. We're also pursuing what the administration calls grand challenges. The president has mentioned many of these publicly, trying to make solar energy as cheap as coal, making electric vehicles as affordable as gasoline-powered vehicles. Recently announced grand challenges include the asteroid grand challenge, how to do a better job of finding and figuring out how to deal with asteroids that might be on a collision course with the Earth, the USAID Grand Challenges for Development, and the President's BRAIN Initiative, and I'll say a bit more about that. The BRAIN Initiative stands for Brain Research through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies, and this is aimed at understanding better how the brain works by being able to map the performance of the brain in terms of clusters of neurons, not just individual ones, whole sections of the brain, clearly applicable to a number of practical challenges, preventing, treating, and curing brain disorders, such as Alzheimer's, epilepsy, Parkinson's, traumatic brain injury. Also very important for post-traumatic stress syndrome. Important as well for cognition and learning. If we understood better how the brain works, we could probably do a better job in the domain of teaching and learning. Federal government was putting $100 million into this domain in FY14. In FY15, that will be doubled if the president's budget is passed by the Congress. We have substantial private sector commitments from a number of different foundations. Most of the action is taking place at NIH, DARPA, NSF, and a bit at FDA. And we'll be having a big event this summer recognizing a variety of the commitments being made and the progress being made in this domain. STEM education, extremely important to this president and this administration. The president has been known to say that he thinks the single most important thing we could do for the future of our country is to lift our game in STEM education. That starts with setting ambitious goals, includes incorporating STEM education into our overall education reform strategy. That started with Race to the Top. Building a strong effort to include businesses, nonprofits, and foundations. Educate to Innovate, which the president launched in November 2009, had commitments from over 100 CEOs coordinating under the Change the Equation component of the Educate to Innovate initiative. 150 organizations committing to the President's goal of training 100,000 new excellent STEM teachers, and $100 million invested so far toward the goal of increasing over the next decade by 1 million the number of college graduates in STEM fields in the United States. Under business as usual, there would be 3 million in a decade. We want 4 million in the next decade. We have, as I already mentioned under events, deployed the President's personal passion for STEM in a wide variety of public events. And coming up in 2014 will be the first ever Maker Fair focused on getting kids and adults to make things rather than just consuming things. We are institutionalizing cross-agency efforts. We have a 5-year STEM education strategic plan that was released last year, and participation in that by all of the agencies that run individual education programs and outreach programs in science, technology, engineering, and math. The President never fails to appear personally when we have winners of presidential prizes for teaching and mentoring, the PEMST Awards, Presidential Awards for Excellence in Math and Science Teaching, the PCAST Awards, the Presidential Early Career Awards in Science and Engineering. He always comes, he always shakes hands and talks with every single awardee. Not all past presidents have done this. His schedulers hate it because it takes a long time to shake 100 hands and talk to everybody when there are 100 winners, as there were recently in the PEMST Awards, the Math and Science Teaching Awards. And by the way, I am pleased to report that of the 101 winners of those teaching awards, it was split 50-50 between men and women. Initiatives in the energy and environment space started with $80 billion for clean and efficient energy in the Recovery Act in 2009, funding for the ARPA Energy and 5 energy innovation hubs, first ever fuel economy and tailpipe standards combined with CO2 standards for light-duty vehicles, fuel economy standards for trucks, interagency task force, the predecessor of the council I mentioned before on climate change adaptation, mentioned the National Oceans Policy and the National Oceans Council, issuing a blueprint for a secure energy future in March 2011, and of course the President's Climate Action Plan, which he rolled out last June. There's the President signing the National Oceans Policy Executive Order in July of 2010. Climate Action Plan, as most of you in this room know, has 3 large elements: cutting carbon pollution in America, which includes cutting CO2 from power plants, promoting renewable and other cleaner energy options, fuel economy standards, cutting energy waste, reducing emissions of other heat-trapping substances, and, of course, managing forests. Second ingredient, preparing for the impacts of climate change that we don't succeed in avoiding, which has involved directing agencies to support climate-resilient investments, looking at their missions, at the agency missions, how climate change might affect those missions and what they need to do to minimize adverse impacts, work to manage the risks from floods, droughts, and wildfires, and, of course, mobilizing science and data for climate resilience. We will be issuing in the next couple months the 3rd National Climate Assessment, looking at impacts of climate change on the United States on a regional and sectoral basis and how those impacts can be reduced. And the third element, of course, leading international efforts on climate change, which involves both bilateral and multilateral engagement on both mitigation and adaptation, and helping to mobilize finance so that people in the less developed parts of the world can make the investments that they need to make to address this problem. Part of the Climate Action Plan is a quadrennial energy review. This was initially proposed by PCAST in November of 2010. First phase of the effort was the Quadrennial Technology Review that DOE conducted and completed a year later. President announced the full-blown interagency QER as part of his Climate Action Plan, and it was made official in terms of structure and duties in a presidential memorandum just in January. It's led by an interagency working group chaired in the White House by me and Dan Utek, who is the head of the White House Office on Energy and Climate Change, and supported by a 60-person secretariat in the Department of Energy. And, of course, We will be reaching out to this laboratory and the other DOE laboratories for a lot of work in connection with this effort. Its focus for the first year will be on our infrastructure for energy transport, storage, and distribution, the challenges and opportunities we face in that domain. And it will address both long-standing challenges in the infrastructure as well as emerging ones. Above all, how we get the reliability, the flexibility, and resilience we need while supporting a transition to a much lower carbon energy system. Information technology and innovation, again, a wide variety of initiatives launched and underway. One of the most interesting and I think inspiring is the Connect Ed initiative announced just in the last month or so, where $2 billion from the Federal Communications Commission and over $1 billion from the private sector is going to be used to provide broadband access and computers for 99% of the classrooms across the United States. Data.gov, an enormous effort to make government data sets available and accessible to support innovation and entrepreneurship. Invite anybody interested to go to the website data.gov, where you will find upwards of 127,000 data sets on a wide variety of topics in machine-readable and searchable form. Course correction for NASA. We inherited a NASA in some difficulty. The Constellation Human Exploration Program was behind schedule and over budget. Other programs of NASA were imperiled by the Constellation's overruns. We, in cooperation with the Congress, rebalanced our space policy, slimmed down and retargeted Constellation, emphasizing visits to a near-Earth asteroid and Mars rather than going back to the Moon 50 years later, emphasizing the encouragement of commercial operations to deliver crew and cargo to the International Space Station. We extended the International Space Station operation initially to 2020. We've extended it again now to at least 2024. And we restored support for an array of NASA programs that had been neglected or imperiled in the Constellation era. This is a picture of the first docking of a commercial module with the International Space Station in May 2012, SpaceX Corporation's Dragon capsule. Science in NASA has done well. NASA, under Obama, will have spent $100 billion plus through fiscal year 14, nearly $30 billion of that for cutting-edge science. It's done a lot of good stuff. I get dismayed when I see reports in the media that our space program is falling into second or third place. Absolutely not true. What we are doing is unprecedented in the world in terms of the scope, diversity, depth, and importance of the science missions that we are undertaking. And again, a lot of them are listed here. And the James Webb Space Telescope, the successor to the Hubble, which with 100 times more capacity, is on track to be launched in 2018. This is one of my favorite pictures, our 2,000-pound SUV-sized Mars rover taking its own picture on the surface of Mars. In the second term, the President has been clear about his priorities for science and technology. Science and technology for the economy, obviously very important. Science and technology for biomedicine and health, helping to implement the Affordable Care Act to get better outcomes for more Americans at lower costs. Science and technology for energy and climate, the coupled agendas of clean, efficient, reliable, affordable energy and mitigation, preparedness, and resilience for climate change. Science and technology for open government, that's data.gov, the whole open government enterprise to increase both access and ease of participation by the public. And, of course, STEM education, strengthening the next generation of discoverers, innovators, workers, and citizens. Budgets for science and technology, of course, a huge boost in the Recovery Act, a number of explicit goals, including lifting public and private investment R&D to 3% or more of GDP. President's 2010 budget put us on track to meet that goal. 2011 would have continued the trend, but as you all know, we had setbacks in the appropriations from 2011 through 2014 because of spending caps in legislation passed in 2011 and again in 2013. But despite the setbacks, and this is key, science and technology has fared better in 2011 through 2014 appropriations than most other sectors have. This is a summary of R&D in the President's FY15 budget, the one that was just released on March 4th, with comparisons of FY13 and 14 actual, the President's recommendation for 15, and the change. I hasten to say that the overall increase is not as big as most of the people in this room and most of the people in my office would like to see. We wish there could be even more, but under the budget caps, we faced extremely difficult choices. Nonetheless, discretionary spending overall in the FY15 budget goes up 0.2%, and science and technology go up 6 times more than the overall increase in discretionary spending. So while this is not what we would like in better budget times, it is still doing better than virtually anything else. Some of the highlights, things that did very well in the President's FY15 budget, the R&D at DOE, which includes both the NNSA and defense-related side and the civil side, up 8.4% compared to the 2014 appropriation. National Institutes of Science and Technology labs up 3.4%, NOAA 4.1%, USGS 5.5%. Cross-cutting initiatives, advanced manufacturing goes up 12% to $2.2 billion. BRAIN initiative up 100%, doubling from $100 million to $200 million. Some energy highlights, energy efficiency and renewables go up almost 22%. With the subcategories listed there getting big increases. Natural gas technologies, including carbon capture and storage for natural gas systems, up a factor of 2.9. ARPA-E up 16.1%. We have a proposal in the FY15 budget to do better than the base budget. The numbers I've been showing you up until now are the President's base budget that fall within the spending caps. We have a proposal for an Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative, which would go above the caps and would require separate congressional action to do that. But the proposal includes ways to fund it fully through closing tax loopholes and spending reforms. It would provide $28 billion additional each for the defense and non-defense side of discretionary spending. That would bring total discretionary spending close to the level specified in the Budget Control Act of 2011. Those numbers were reduced in December of 2013. Of that $56 billion total, nearly 10% would be for research. And the breakdown is given here, nearly another billion for NIH, nearly another billion for NASA, $2 billion more for DOD, $500 million for NSF. And in addition to those research funds, there would be another billion for a climate resilience fund that would boost the efforts on climate change resilience that are already in the regular budget. We have a lot of challenges ahead. Sustaining support for science and technology under budget caps is clearly, in a way, the biggest one. And there are some categories that are particularly challenging. Supporting sufficient investments in advanced technology and commercial crew in NASA. For NOAA, the polar orbiting satellites, which are very expensive but very important. And marine science. For DOE, CO2 capture and fusion are particular challenges. NSF, we need to make sure we protect NSF's role in funding basic research. There are some efforts from some in Congress to force NSF to defend every grant on basis of immediate relevance to the national interest, defined not to include advances in basic science. We are opposed to those. NSF is the most important funder of basic science in the federal government, and we need to keep it that way. There are also attacks on social science in NSF, which we think are misguided and will oppose. USDA, we need further efforts to expand the peer-reviewed part of agricultural science, which USDA supports. Regulatory science is always a challenge, and some folks in Congress don't like regulation, and they figure if we do less regulatory science, we'll have less regulation. In fact, we'll just have less intelligent regulation if we do less regulatory science. U.S. Global Change Research Program, of course, always a challenge to defend our investments in climate science and sustainability science. And international cooperation is always a challenge to protect, because some folks think that international cooperation just means giving away U.S. secrets and competitive advantage. It doesn't, but it takes some explaining. NIH funding is generally less contentious. Everybody in Congress is in favor of it. But the NIH budget is already so big at over $30 billion that increasing it in percentage terms that are meaningful is very difficult under the budget caps. Few final challenges, broad challenges that we face in the science, technology, and policy space. I mentioned this one already. How do we best accelerate the translation of scientific and engineering advances into economic and social benefit? And we think key to that is closer public-private academic partnerships. Second, how do we advance a coherent energy climate policy? The President has certainly started that process with the Climate Action Plan, but there is more that needs to be done. We need increased public and private investments in both mitigation and adaptation. We need to address some systemic weaknesses in STEM education, including what is often weak science and math teacher competence at the K through 12 levels, and at the college level, a lot of inertia against adopting more effective teaching methods. And finally, we need to get better at getting key messages across, the messages about how and why science and engineering matter, and of course, messages about how science works. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Sit down. Well, thank you. And we're going to open it up to questions now, but I'm going to use my prerogative and ask you the first question, which relates to some of the things you touched on in your discussion. One of your roles that you alluded to is engagement internationally in various ministerial groups and so forth, and clearly science is an international enterprise, and we have partnerships. It's something that we focus on here at the lab. We want to make sure we're always at the cutting edge, but we're also working with our peers and competitors around the world. And at times it can be a little bit paradoxical that we are often making the case for investments in science and technology on the basis of economic return, which is clearly, more of a domestic realization. And if you think about the landscape that was laid out in the Endless Frontier, that was at a time when the U.S. was the dominant global economy. So perhaps it was possible to make the investments in fundamental research and even applied R&D without too much worry about where those investments would be realized, because as the dominant global economy, we knew that the U.S. would get its fair share. 21st century, we're one of a number of major economies, and many of those economies are making larger investments than they were in science and technology. So we can no longer be certain that the results of our investments will be manifested in the domestic economy. So what are your thoughts on how we articulate the basis for making those investments for economic return in a global science environment where we are working with and competing with countries around the world?
It's a complicated topic, but I would make a number of points. One, science and engineering are, of course, far more globalized today than they were 40 or 50 years ago. And as a result of that globalization, our cooperation with other countries in specific dimensions of science and technology often bring advantages to us because they bring us access to particular pockets of expertise that can accelerate innovation in our country. In other words, it's not a one-way street where by cooperating with others we just accelerate innovation there. We are getting benefits from the fact that the talent, the facilities are now more widespread. Secondly, there are aspects of science and technology where the expense of the facilities is so great that no one country is likely to do it alone. And so we see the Large Hadron Collider, we see the ITER project, we see the International Space Station, where we benefit from being able to share both the costs and the risks with other countries. Third thing I would say is that most of the cooperation we do, nearly all of it, is in domains that would be characterized as pre-competitive. And so ultimately what determines who gets the economic benefit is how good you are at translating discovery into practical applications, and that's something in which I think we retain the lead and are the envy of the world. In fact, everywhere I go around the world, what I get most asked by my counterpart ministers of science and technology is, how are you doing so well even though we know we need to do better. How are you doing so well at translating advantages from your research universities and national laboratories into economic and social benefit? The fourth thing I would say is there are a variety of focuses of our cooperation that are on problems whose solutions need to be global. For example, we cooperate on clean energy technologies with all of the countries I listed, and the reason for that in part is we all live under one atmosphere, and reducing CO2 emissions anywhere is a benefit everywhere. Similarly, we cooperate with most of those countries, those that have nuclear energy, on improving nuclear safety. And the reason for that is obvious. A nuclear accident anywhere is a setback for nuclear energy everywhere. So it's in our interest to work with others to do that. We cooperate with the Chinese on clean and efficient vehicles, for example. It's a benefit to us as well as them to do that because the demand that China makes in the world oil market, which is enormously rapidly increasing automobile population, is a problem for everybody in that it elevates the world oil price. And in addition, we now know that pollution from China makes it all the way across the Pacific and makes it more difficult for Los Angeles to meet its air pollution standards. So we have a lot of reasons to cooperate. The last one I'll mention, we cooperate with China on influenza. Turns out that most influenza originates in that part of the world, and by that cooperation, we get more notice to develop and distribute vaccines.
I'm sure there are questions in the audience, so. Marilyn?
Thank you.
There's a microphone if you can just hang on.
In your role as policy advisor, I guess I should step back. Your role as Office of the President of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. It has policy in it. Okay, so much of what you addressed today was about policy for science and technology. Regarding science and technology policy in the energy domain, there are many policy questions surrounding the development of energy infrastructure in this country. And I wondered if you had any activities ongoing to try to break the stalemate in so many areas of energy infrastructure issues, such as the Keystone Pipeline, the construction and improvement of the electric grid in order to bring in more renewables to population pockets, the construction of facilities for LNG export, on and on. The list just is enormous. Is there any kind of a policy think tank that you're operating that is helping to facilitate and enable these types of infrastructure improvements, which are so important to the resilience of our energy enterprise?
Let me answer that in two ways. One, recognition of the challenges to and for our energy infrastructure has affected our spending and our research and development strategy in energy from the beginning of this administration. And there have been substantial efforts in the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Interior, and interagency consultations to address that. But as I noted in my talk, in addition, we have now made the energy infrastructure the entire focus of the first year of the full-fledged Quadrennial Energy Review. And that is a full interagency process supported by a 60-person secretariat in DOE, but with a council overseeing it that I co-chair with the head of the White House Office of Energy and Climate Change. And on that council sit the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of Transportation, the Secretary of Interior, the EPA Administrator, and so on through the list, the Secretary of Agriculture. And we are determined to address both the short-term and the longer-term challenges that infrastructure faces in the energy sector, and that will include transmission grids, pipelines, LNG facilities, the whole works. So the importance of that set of issues is very clearly recognized, has been recognized from the beginning, but we are lifting our game through the QER.
Okay, we got a social media question that's a little bit of a change in direction. Who sparked your interest in science when you were growing up?
You know, that is a great question. I was interested in science as far back as I can remember. I had a chemistry set starting, I think, in the second grade, created a number of explosions in my bedroom at a very early age. The ceiling in that bedroom was stained with the results of these explosions forever after. At the age of 9, I was making solid fuel rockets with my mother's discarded lipstick tubes and fueled by chemicals from my chemistry set in the drugstore. Fortunately, you can no longer get all those chemicals in drugstores. But I did a lot of reading as a kid, and again, as far back as I can remember, reading about science and technology was high on the list. I was fascinated by space and rockets, fascinated by aviation, and that interest, of course, got nourished all along the way by a variety of terrific teachers. One of the things we say in talking about STEM education is that almost everybody in science, technology, math, innovation can remember one or more teachers who had a big effect on them. My second grade teacher, Miss Medler, had a huge effect on me. My sixth grade teacher, Mrs. Azevedo, had a huge effect. And my high school algebra teacher, a guy named Dwight Allen, who was actually a Stanford education professor on leave, actually teaching in the classroom, had an enormous effect.
Well, this proves my theory that all physicists were pyromaniacs as children. So another social media question that's very appropriate given the fact that we're sitting at Oak Ridge National Lab is I'll rephrase it a little bit, how can the National Labs advance the national science agenda that you just outlined?
Well, that's a great question and one that we have thought about. The Educate to Innovate initiative includes, among other dimensions, an effort to improve both the quality of science and math teaching at the K through 12 levels and the provision of role models for kids in those impressionable ages to get interested in science and math and engineering by taking practicing scientists, engineers, and mathematicians from our national labs, from our research universities, and from the private sector, and getting them to devote a modest part of their time to going into classrooms, working with teachers to improve the content of their science, technology, and math teaching, including raising its relevance by linking what is being taught about science and math and technology to the real-world problems that these practicing scientists, engineers, and mathematicians work on, but also serving as role models so kids can get a first-hand sense of what interesting and enthusiastic people are doing this work out in the real world, and so they can get a sense of the kinds of careers that are available. And that is an effort in which our national labs are participating. We hope to raise the level of that participation because we think it's extremely effective. There's nothing that works as well for getting kids interested in science and math as understanding the relevance of these domains in the real world and the exciting jobs that are available pursuing them, and also seeing actual people who do it as human beings who are excited about their work.
So I think we have time for probably one more question, so I'll turn this one back to the audience and see if there's another. Amit.
In investments in pre-competitive research for many decades. But as other countries become players globally, they're choosing to invest a lot in high-risk, high-payoff competitive research. So I was wondering if you can comment on whether we should invest even more in the high-risk, high-payoff competitive research area for long-term competitiveness.
For
long-term competitiveness of the U.S.
Well, the short answer is yes. Yes, we should invest more in high-risk, high-return research related to long-term competitiveness. I mentioned that as the fourth cross-cutting item in my list of ingredients of the American Innovation Strategy, which the President launched at the beginning of his administration and has refined since. It is, of course, a challenge in the budget environment in which we live, but we've got to keep doing it, and I think that priority is reflected in the FY15 budget. You see this in the work of ARPA-E, for example, in a very conspicuous way. One sees it in the National Network for Manufacturing Innovation. It is true that others are doing more, but the United States is still by far the largest funder of research and development in the world. China is growing fast, And that, of course, ultimately will be a competitiveness challenge. But it should only encourage us to find ways to do more and to do it better.
Okay, well, I think we're pretty much at the end of our time. I'd like to offer, by way of thanks, a rather heavy recognition, which includes an image of Eugene Wigner and an acknowledgement for your taking the time to come and join us.
Oh, well, thank you very much. This will have a place of pride on my trophy desk.
And I should also, before the crowd disperses, let everyone know that the next Wigner lecture is going to take place on April the 8th. The speaker will be Craig Barrett, the former president and CEO of Intel, who has played a significant role in recent years, really helping making the case for federal investments in science and technology with things like the Rising Above the Gathering Storm report.
And also in STEM education. Craig has been a co-chair of the Educate to Innovate initiative that I've been talking about, and has been a huge asset in the effort to lift our game in STEM education.
Not to mention his own philanthropic activities,
Indeed.
I think particularly with Arizona State. But
Good.
thank you very much.
Thank you.